The overview for today is divided into 4 different sections. Section 1 is the story so far. That will just be a recap of the first 2 chapters. Then next we have section 2, Pride and Prejudice. I'm not sure if anyone has read a book with that theme or that title, but this section will have some shared themes. Next, the Decree of Doom. That sounds a bit ominous, but we'll get into that later. And then finally, section 4, the beginning of the end. So before we get into a recap of the story so far, let's talk about the book of Esther as a whole. So first off, who even wrote the book of Esther? And ironically, no one actually knows the answer to that. Some think it might have been Mordecai himself, while others think it was an anonymous Jewish writer in the Persian Empire who wanted to preserve the story of how the Jewish people were nearly destroyed and then suddenly delivered. But regardless of who wrote it, one thing is very important, that not only does the author stay hidden, but the author of history stays hidden, and that is God. So in the entire book of Esther, God is never mentioned, not even once. But as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that even though he's not named, he's still working behind the scenes. Okay, so now let's get into a timeline. This is just recapping the first 2 chapters, but I thought just to better visualize it, it will be better with a chronological timeline starting from year 0, which is the year of when King Ahasuerus became king. Next. Okay, so King Ahasuerus, he's the king of Persia. He becomes king in 486 BC. Next, going into year 3, is when Queen Vashti is dethroned. So Queen Vashti, that was the queen during that time. We see right off the bat in Esther chapter 1, verse 3, we see this queen disobeyed the king's command and is dethroned. And that theme of disobedience, even though that king's command wasn't a very good command, was actually a very bad one, but even though that was a bad command, we'll see later on, not only in the book of Esther, but in the Bible as a whole, how the theme of disobedience is very important, especially when it's being disobedient to God. Okay, year 6, Esther is taken into the king's palace. Now moving from year 6 to year 7, Esther becomes queen. So just within a 1-year transition, Esther becomes queen, and then we fast forward 5 years. For 5 years, nothing really happens, like nothing major. But then from year 7 to year 12 is when Haman, this antagonist of the story, this evil dude, he comes in and he starts conspiring against the Jews. And then we'll get into exactly what that conspiring consists of. Okay, this is the second section. Before we talk about Haman, we have to kind of rewind a bit. We have to learn about, first of all, who is Haman and why does he hate the Jews and what is his agenda. So yeah, that is what we will go into. So, rewinding all the way back into the book of Exodus, which happens a long time before the book of Esther takes place, we see this person named Amalek. So if you guys haven't heard of Amalek, he was the leader of the Amalekites, as implied by the name. But more importantly, he was someone who waged war with God and the people of Israel. So the Amalekites attacked Israel first right after the Exodus. So this is when Moses was taking his people out of Egypt, freeing them, and then into the Promised Land. In that period of time when they were in the wilderness or just moving around from place to place, that is when Amalek attacked them. And God knew Amalek's heart. He knew it was a wicked heart. So he declared perpetual judgment on Amalek. It says in Exodus chapter 17, verse 16, "The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." And that's where the title comes from, generational beef. If some of you are unfamiliar with the word beef, you may think, oh, isn't that a food? Isn't that a type of meat? But another definition of the word beef is conflict. So beef could mean you have like a fight with someone. And in this case, Amalek is having a fight with God and the people of Israel. So some of the Amalekites' evil traits, they attacked the weak, they defied God, and they persisted as enemies. And we can see this happen later in the Bible, still before the book of Esther, but after the book of Exodus. We see in 1 Samuel 15, another person by the name of Agag comes into play, and he's the leader of the Agagites, and he's also a descendant of Amalek. So if you guys are unfamiliar with the Agagites, they're essentially, you can think of them as the successors to the Amalekites. So they are essentially the same as the Amalekites, but because this king Agag became a very prevalent figure, they kind of rebranded themselves into having a different name. So we see in 1 Samuel 15:9, it says, Saul and the people spared Agag. So another biblical figure comes into play, which is Saul. King Saul was the very first king of Israel. This was back in the time when they had no king, and they were pressuring the prophet Samuel to demand a king. Like they were in a time of crisis, like everyone else was having a king except them, and they wanted a king. But what happens, we see how Saul spares Agag, and right off the bat you may think, oh, that's kind of normal, right? Like he's acting out of mercy, he's sparing this king. However, going back to that theme of obedience or disobedience, God actually commanded King Saul to kill Agag. And this was because Agag was a very evil man, and as we learned from the Amalekites, they're a very evil group of people, and God just wanted to wipe them off the face of the earth, just like how he did with almost the whole world in the story of Noah and his ark. So like similar concept, but just for the Agagites or Amalekites. But Saul didn't see this bigger picture. He didn't see the world through God's lens. He just saw it through his narrow vision. And we don't know exactly why he spared Agag. It might have been out of misplaced mercy. But he also said that to kind of appease God, he's not just sparing Agag, but he's also going to take all of Agag's wealth and possessions, like his cattle, his livestock, his gold, silver, all of that, and he's going to sacrifice it to God, just to make God happy. And that is where this phrase comes in. Some of you may know this phrase really well, but in 1 Samuel 15:22-23, it says, to obey is better than sacrifice, for rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. And this is what Samuel is telling to Saul. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. So you see, even though Saul may have had good intentions, the act of disobedience to God caused his rejection from God of being the king of Israel. And we'll see some of that play into not only in this chapter, but in the later chapters of the book of Esther. Okay, so we talked about the Amalekites and the Agagites, but how does that play into Haman? First of all, who is Haman? Well, right off the bat in Esther chapter 3, verse 1, it says, Haman is a descendant of King Agag. So now we know he's from the lineage of the same evil people, Amalek, Agag, all their descendants, that same evil lineage of the people who have constantly been attacking the Jews and the people of Israel. Haman is now that person, that descendant. And from all of this context, we know that he has a personal vendetta against the Jews. And if that wasn't clear enough, in verse 10 of chapter 3 even says, Haman is an Agagite and an enemy of the Jews. So we see this theme come into play. Yesterday's sins became today's threat. Because King Agag was spared in the past, now his descendant becomes a threat in the present. And we kind of see this parallel between Esther and King Saul. You might think, how does Esther relate to Saul? They're completely different. But we see a couple similarities. Esther, like Saul, is from the tribe of Benjamin. And also, Esther was chosen by God to become a royal leader in the time of crisis, just like Saul was back in the day. Some may even call Esther as the redemption of Saul, a second chance given to the people of Israel to right Saul's wrongdoings. But just as Saul was rejected as king, will we see Esther rejected as queen? Well, it all comes down to her obedience to God. And that's something we'll see in the later chapters, but we won't get into that quite yet for this chapter. Okay, so now let's get into the actual plot of the chapter. This is two characters come to play, Haman and Mordecai. So what happens is Haman was promoted to a very high position by the king, King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, if you will. And everyone was commanded to bow down to him. This wasn't a specific commandment just for Haman per se, but it was just like a Persian custom or Persian law, where if someone is in a really high position, such as the king or the king's second in command, then everyone has to bow down to him. It could have been just like a polite thing, or it could have been ingrained in their Persian law. But we see how most of the people there, it doesn't record their names or anything, but we see how they most likely just bow down. They just complied. They just said, okay, this is a law. We don't want to get in trouble. Let's just bow down and call it a day. But we see Mordecai refused to bow down. And if we remember from the previous chapters, Mordecai was the cousin of Esther, and he was this wise figure in Esther's life, just guiding Esther throughout her journey of becoming queen. And we also see Mordecai has a heart for God. He wants to follow God, and he doesn't want to follow any men or any evilness of the men. And in this case, this is kind of like an evil thing. Haman is just acting out of pride, wanting everyone to bow down to him. But Mordecai refused. He did not bow down to him. And Haman sees this. He sees Mordecai not bowing down. And we know that Haman was obviously very mad at this, because we know Haman was a very prideful figure. But we see this term used where it says Haman disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So if we look at the Google definition of this word, disdain is the feeling that someone or something is unworthy of one's consideration or respect. So essentially what it's saying is Haman thought Mordecai was beneath them. He thought Mordecai was too little, and laying hands on Mordecai alone, that would be too small of a plan. He wanted to think bigger. And his bigger plan was destroying all of the Jews, because Mordecai was a Jew, and as we know from the previous context, Haman hates the Jews. He hates the people of Israel. So the way to feed his pride, his own ego, and his prejudice of the Jews, he wanted to just destroy all of them. Okay, so now that we've discussed that, let's talk exactly what the actual decree of. How far does Haman's hatred go? Does he want to just imprison the Jews? Does he want to enslave them? Or does he want to send them to an island of perpetual tickling? Well, we'll find out in the next slide. Okay, so here's the decree. By the king's command, all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. In Esther chapter 3, verse 13. So wow, that is very, very crazy, very far-fetched, if you will. But what we don't know is that through all this hatred, through all this injustice happening, God is still working in the background. So if you see this, you might be discouraged, but don't feel bad yet for the Jews, because you haven't seen everything that is going to happen. So yeah, let's talk about how Haman decides which day into killing all of the Jews. So and he does this by casting pur, aka lots, aka just the throwing of dice. In their day and age, they probably use something different than dice, but dice is probably the closest thing in our culture, in our modern age, that we can relate to this. So yeah, they cast pur for determining the day of destruction for the Jews. And in Persian culture, casting lots was believed to reveal God's will. And ironically, the lot landed on the last month. So the 13th day of the last month was when the lots fell, and it's when Haman was kind of forced to pick the day of destruction, the doomsday for all of the Jews. And we see this verse, Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So Haman wanted it quick. He wanted to kill the Jews right away. They were actually casting the lots during the month of Nisan, which technically is like in March/April, so like kind of the time right now. But it was actually the first month of their calendar year at that time. So he cast this lots in the first month, but it lands all the way into the very last month of the year. So this just shows that God decides. Ultimately, God decides when things happen. we may think that we are in complete control. We may think that we can have our way, but ultimately, God is moving all the pieces. We are just little dice in, if you will, we're little dice in His ultimate plan. And His ultimate plan will work everything for our good. But in the meantime, Haman thinks that he is in control and everything is working for his own good, not for God's good. Okay, so now let's get into manipulation by Haman, or Haman manipulation. So Haman applies two manipulation tactics to the king. So essentially what's going on is Haman decided the date on when to kill the Jews, and he already knows, like, he wants to kill the Jews, but he's not the king of Persia. King Ahasuerus is the king of Persia, and he needs to get the king on board with this plan, otherwise he cannot succeed. He cannot do this all on his own. So he's a bit fearful or worried that if he says something the wrong way, then the king might say, like, oh, I don't want to kill a whole nation. I think that's a bit too much for me. So he applies two different tactics. So let's get into the two tactics. First is framing. So if you don't know what the word framing is, essentially it is a way of vaguely describing something to fit your own narrative or your own propaganda, but leaving out a lot of details or phrasing it in such a way that it feels way worse than it is, or it feels exactly how you want it to look like in the minds of your audience. So Haman vaguely describes the Jews as a people that do not keep the king's laws. And essentially what this does is it creates us versus them mentality. The us in this case is Haman, the king, and the them is all the Jews. And we don't know for sure if at this time the king knew who all the Jews were. He might have known that, like, Haman was referring to the Jews, or he might have just thought that it was just some random people. But what we do know is by phrasing it in this way, this feeds on the pride of the king. Just as we saw that Haman had pride and prejudice, we see that the king has pride. The king doesn't have any prejudice that we know of, but he does have pride, and Haman uses that pride to his advantage. Okay, so to give you a visual example of what Haman is doing, since it might be hard to grasp with just words, on the left you see a picture of, I believe that's like a mother lion, eating a little cub. So just by a show of hands, do you guys think this is unjust? Do you think that this mother lion is evil? Does anyone think this mother lion is evil? Okay, I see a couple of hands. Okay, there's a few hands. It is a bit of a trick question. Maybe most of you knew that. But if we go to the next picture, now we see a different perspective. So the mother lion isn't actually eating that little cub, but it's actually just holding the cub, since that is the way mother lions just hold their babies. They hold them by their neck with their mouth. That is just the custom for the animal. And who are we to judge? Like, that's the way they do it. And as you can see, the cub looks, can't really tell if it's happy or not, but at least you can see the cub is unarmed. The cub is not in any danger. The cub is not dead. The cub is not half swallowed by the mother lion. And that is essentially what's going on with Haman and the king. Haman is phrasing the Jews like how I phrased that mother lion in the first picture. However, what's actually happening is in the second picture. So Haman was talking about the Jews as if they were some evil people not obeying the king. But actually, that might have been a little bit half-true, just like the half-truth in this was that the baby cub was in the mouth of the mother lion, but the full truth is the mother lion wasn't eating that baby cub. Okay, so now let's get into tactic number 2, reverse psychology. So I don't think an illustration is needed for this. I'm sure most of you know reverse psychology. You may have used it on other people. You may have been used by this. Well, reverse psychology is essentially saying something of like the opposite of what you intend to happen. So let's break this down. In Esther's chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, Haman claims he will personally pay for having the Jews be destroyed. So he's telling the king, okay, there's these evil people, he vaguely describes them, and we have to destroy them, and I will personally pay to have them destroyed. Don't worry about this, king. Don't even sweat. I will do all of this just for you. That's how he phrases it. And then this makes the decree way more appealing to the king, because not only it feeds on his pride of, hey, these are people that are not keeping my commandments, I want to get rid of them, but also makes the king think of Haman as this like nice guy, like, wow, he's doing all of this for me, he's willing to pay for all of it. But actually, this is just reverse psychology. And we don't know exactly what Haman's intent is, but we do know what actually played out, and is the king offers to pay instead. And not only does he pay instead, but he gives Haman his signet ring. So there's two things going on. One, Haman gets his way. The plan to kill the Jews is coming into motion, and the king even pays instead of Haman having to pay. It's like a win-win for Haman. But what is essentially happening is Haman is not only getting everything he needs to kill the Jews, but now the responsibility is being shifted onto the king. So the king gives his signet ring. In the Persian culture, when you have the signet ring, you can seal any official like documents or decrees or whatever, and whoever seals it, it's through their name. It's like saying something and signing it at the end with your own name. So essentially, the king trusts Haman so much that he's giving him his signature. So signet ring, you can think of it as a signature, you can think of it as the keys to your house. However the analogy plays out, it's shifting all the responsibility to the king. So if anything backfires, then Haman can just blame it on the king. He doesn't have to have this responsibility of killing the Jews, even though it's his plan, even though he wants this to happen. Okay, so now this gets into the beginning of the end. So this slide is titled The Normalcy of Abnormality. What essentially is happening here in Esther chapter 3, verses 12 to 14, is the genocidal law gets passed. And if you heard the term I used right there, genocidal law, then we know it's not just any law, it's something very crucial, something very important, something that's going to potentially wipe out a whole group of people just based on their own ethnicity. And not only was it passed, but it was passed as if it was any normal law. Any other law that happens, this same law was passed just like that. And we kind of see that play out in the current world today. We do see like some laws that are clearly against the scripture, against the Bible, but they get passed as if they were normal, as if everyone should believe in that. And not only are they passed as if they're normal, they're also encouraged. Some people are encouraged to do certain things that are against God. And there are many examples of this in our modern age, but I just wanted to highlight two different examples. The first being abortion. So we know that abortion is prevalent in our day and age. And let me give you the Google definition of the word abortion. So Google defines it as the deliberate termination of a human pregnancy, most often performed during the first 28 weeks of pregnancy. In a way, you can kind of see this similar to how Haman vaguely described the Jews as a people that do not keep the king's laws. So completely different context, but same concept, where it's misleading and it sugarcoats the true definition of abortion. And the true definition of abortion is the intentional murder of a human baby. So we know right off the bat, if we scroll through the Old Testament, if we look through the 10 Commandments, we know that murder is wrong. And in fact, murder is one of the worst sins you could ever commit. But somehow, through the people of this world, Satan has just infiltrated, and he's made it normal for this term abortion to not only be talked about, but also take place. And millions of babies die each year just because of this. And we kind of see how the genocide of all the babies is similar to the potential genocide of all the Jews that Haman is trying to do. So some people may think that biblical stories aren't applicable in our day and age, our current day and age, but we kind of see a parallel here with Haman trying to kill all of the Jews simply for being Jews, and Satan, through the people of this world, using them as however he sees fit, trying to kill a lot of babies simply for being babies. Okay, another topic that's very prevalent in our day and age is all of the LGBTQ related policies. So I kind of just grouped this into one, since I guess many of you are familiar with the acronym. They group themselves together as one. But this can encompass from same-sex marriages to transgender men in women's sports, private spaces, etc. And also laws saying children can make permanent changes to their body, which completely just go against the nature of God. Since we know that God says marriage is between one man and one woman, and even if before you are born, God has already decided your gender, and that's not something you can change. So we see how through not only these two topics, but we see a lot more things that I haven't mentioned throughout that's just going on in our modern day and age. We see a lot of evil and a lot of chaos and confusion. And the key takeaway in this is if we don't stand up against evil, it will grow into chaos and destruction. And we see this verse from James 4:17. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. So we know that, one, we all know sin is if you do something wrong, like that goes against the 10 Commandments or all the other relevant commandments in the Bible. But we also see if you fail to do what is good or to stand up against evil, even though you're not technically doing anything wrong, in the eyes of God, it is still considered a sin. And we have a term for that, the sin of omission. So even if you're acting idle, like literally doing nothing, that can still be considered a sin. And we should stand against evil, because if we ignore what God commands, sin will become normalized and destructive laws and practices begin to shape our society. Okay, so now we're drawing to the very end of the chapter. And we see what's essentially happening is Haman and the king were drinking and celebrating, and everyone in the city of Shushan, which was one of the cities in the Persian Empire at that time, they were very perplexed or confused. They were thinking, hey, we just saw this decree get passed. Now why is Haman and why is the king, why are they drinking? Why are they celebrating? Because if you celebrate after a decree has been issued, a very important decree as a matter of fact, then that kind of just reinforces the decree's validity. Because if you don't celebrate, then people think, oh, something's wrong. Maybe this decree was passed by accident. Maybe it's all just one big misunderstanding. But no, the king and Haman were celebrating. So everyone knew that, okay, this decree is the real deal. This decree is important. And we see a verse kind of describing what Haman and the king are doing, which is, the wicked rejoice in the face of evil. So the king might have been tricked. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt for now. But Haman, for sure, we know he is evil. We know he has a long-standing vendetta against the Jews. And we know he not only wanted to kill Mordecai, he wants to kill the entire Jewish race. And we see that the wicked rejoice in the face of evil. And we also see that, just like the Israelites, God's people kind of going more than just the Israelites. God's people is always the target of persecution, genocide, and other conflict, even in the modern day. And sometimes all of the evil people in the world, they just rejoice at the sight of all this conflict, at the sight of all our turmoil, all the persecution going on in the world. But you may think this chapter is, as we're drawing to a close, this chapter is ending in doom and gloom. It's ending in just like the worst possible way. And we also see the picture saying everything is awesome. Well, this picture kind of works as a double meaning, because in one sense, the picture serves as describing the state of Haman and the king, because they're evil, but they're rejoicing. They're saying, hey, everything is awesome. But in another point, we can think of it as, hey, everything is awesome in the sense that we can rest assured. We have the God who created the heavens and the earth, who created the entire universe. Like, just Haman passing a decree, surely if someone who created the entire universe, he can fix like a little decree within that universe. And I don't want to spoil everything that's happening. I'm sure lots of you know exactly what's going to happen, but I will hint at it. And in the next chapters, we will see God turning some tables. And I just want to give everyone a verse of hope. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Okay, so now let's get into our little conclusion side. The end is not the end. So here are 4 different takeaways that we kind of learned in this chapter, and just I wanted all of you to just remember as you go about the rest of your month. So takeaway number 1, guard your heart. Because as we've seen happen with Haman, he had this envy for the Jews. It grew into pride, then hatred, and then finally destruction. Well, the destruction is also kind of a bit foreshadowing, but for now, let's think of it as potential destruction for the Jews. And we see these verses, James 3:16 talking about envy, 1 Peter 5:5 talking about pride, and we see how we should avoid all of this, because if we don't avoid it, we can end up like Haman. We can end up very wicked, and that would just make ourselves be on the wrong side of God's story. And since God is the one who created the whole heavens and the earth, we should be on his side, not just out of fear for him, but also out of love for him. Okay, takeaway number 2, protect truth. So Haman manipulated the king with his half-truths, and this put the whole Jewish nation into jeopardy. We see in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25, and Colossians 3:9, that truth is very important. God wants all of us to be honest. It doesn't matter in small ways, it doesn't matter in big ways. We should always be honest. And sometimes people think they mistake honesty for partial honesty. They think, oh, if I have some truth, but I sprinkle in a little bit of a lie, or I stretch the truth a little bit, it might be like a little bit of a sin, but it's not as bad as just completely lying. And they may have the term a white lie. But as we see, even white lies, even half-truths, can lead to a lot of damage. And honestly, it just taints your heart. And we should make sure that our mind, our soul, our hearts, it's all pure in the eyes of God. Since even though the people of this world may not know what we're doing, what we're lying about, we may get away with it with the people, but we will never get away with it with God. Okay, 3rd point, stay vigilant. Passive authority allows evil to spread. This is more of a point for King Ahasuerus, not really for Haman, because Haman's very vigilant. He's acting as like an evil vigilante. He's going around trying to do his best to just kill the people he thinks are bad, the weak. Well, the king, on the other hand, he's not vigilant. He's very passive. He's over-trusting of Haman, and this in turn allows evil to spread. We see these themes in Ephesians 5:11 and Romans 13:3-4. So I encourage you to check out those verses, and you kind of will learn more about just trusting in God and making sure that you are aware of all the evil people and all of their schemes. And that just comes through just wisdom and discernment that you can get by prayer, fasting, reading the Bible, all of these great things. Finally, trust God's justice. So Haman, first of all, he didn't even trust God, but this is telling you to do something one step further, which is to trust his justice. So if someone wronged you, it's not your place to go and seek revenge. God does not call us to do that. Because as we see in Romans 12:19, vengeance belongs to God, to him. God is in control of the whole situation. We may think that we have to take matters into our own hands to take revenge on someone who did wrong. We may think maybe we just want revenge for our own satisfaction, or we may have misplaced thoughts about it where we're thinking the revenge is going to teach him a lesson or teach her a lesson. and that we're actually doing this for their good as well. But we should not have that mindset. We should trust God's justice. We may not know how things turn out, but we do know that God knows how things turn out. And kind of just giving like a little extra hope for anyone who's feeling hopeless about this chapter. I want to draw a parallel between Haman and Jesus, or technically not a parallel, a contrast. So Haman, in this chapter, he's trying to bring utter death to all the Jews through his unjust law. But we know Jesus brings eternal life to all believers through his grace. So with that, I just want to say, trust Jesus, trust God, follow his way, and all things will work together for the good. It may not happen now, it may not happen in this instant, but we know it will happen. And we should just continue with that hope, continue with that trust and faith in God. Because faith as small as a mustard seed can move mountains. Thank you.